Hello, everybody. Very happy to have Christopher Lee here for the eighth episode of the Martial Praxis podcast. We're going to be discussing Aikido. He's done a lot of research into the history of Aikido and has some unique insights that I think will help both unpack it historically and also provide us with some insights as to how we should actually be practicing if we want to make progress. So, very happy to have you here. Thanks for doing this.
Great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Do you think we could just start if you could tell us a little bit about your background, both in Aikido and then
Mhm.
also talking a little bit about the research you've been doing? It seems like quite an ongoing project. You also run a really prolific and interesting blog as well as a Facebook page that posts a lot of good content.
Well, I started training in Aikido in 1981, so I'm pretty old. Uh, I think I was 17 at the time, right? To give you an idea, but I originally started on the U.S. mainland under Mitsuki Satome, if you are aware who he is, right? One of the Aikikai Shihan that came
Yeah.
to the mainland. And then after that, I think in 1989, oh no, 1982, shortly after I started, actually, I went to Japan for the first time for 3 months and trained at Aikikai Hombu Dojo. And then came back. And then again in 1989, I ended up moving to Japan for a short time, but which turned into a long time, right? As you know, as those things happen, right? You get married, you
Yes.
have kids, and one year turns into more years. And in between then and now, I moved back to Hawaii for a few years, and I moved back to Japan for a few years, and back to Hawaii, and now back in Japan again, hopefully permanently, as I'm settling down. I've done mostly Aikido, but I've also trained a lot in a lot of different things, right? One of the advantages of living in Japan is that there's Budo everywhere,
Yeah.
right? Little Budo places, neighborhood places. And so I ended up training with a lot of different people, Tomiki people, Yoshinkan people, Daitoryu people, Japanese Koryu people. So I had a wide breadth of experience. And then after I moved back to Hawaii around, I want to say around 2010, then I started training also with Dan Harden. If you
Ah,
know Dan, he's kind of a common figure on some of the internet forums.
yeah.
Maybe a little bit controversial sometimes.
Well, I'm actually quite familiar with his work because I've been involved in Mike Sigmund's forums for quite
Oh,
some
okay.
time, and
Okay. Yeah.
they have like some kind of connection between the two of them. I'm not quite sure if
They
it's
have
good anymore, but
kind of a rivalry, let's
yeah,
say.
but they do put out
I
some
know Mike
similar
too.
stuff.
Yeah, I know Mike too. We had him out to Hawaii
Oh,
back,
cool.
I think actually before Dan. Um, and then Dan came out a little bit after that. So yeah, I've been friendly with Mike. Mike and Dan have their thing going. I don't want to get in the middle of that. But yeah, I enjoyed training with Mike too. He has a lot of interesting ideas. And those conversations between Mike and Dan and a number of other people, right, on AikiWeb, were a lot of the things that were fundamental, right, to the internal power crowd, as they say.
Yes.
I mean, it's quite diverse, right?
Yeah.
But it is pretty diverse. After I came, well, I had spoken with Dan for a long time, back from the end of the 1990s, I think, back when they had Aikido L was a mailing list when they had mailing lists, right? So everybody communicated by email. And he came on and caused some trouble or some controversy, right? And I thought it was full of crap, basically, right?
Yeah.
And then, but we spoke then, and then later on IKWeb and places like eBudo, we argued for a long time, right? Him, me, Mike, lots of people, and eventually, at one point, I ended up moving back to Japan. I think that was in year 2000, right? Uh, some of my relatives, my wife's relatives, became ill, so we moved back to Japan. And at that point, my Japanese reading ability had been getting better, right?
Uh,
So when I was here at that time, that was after I'd been having these conversations. Uh, then I was able to look at more original sources because I was here in Japan.
yeah,
That was about the time that Tomino Takada, the Transparent Power book, came out. So I was able to read that in Japanese. And actually, one of the people I was training with at the time, went to see Kimura Tatsuo, uh, who wrote that book,
yeah,
Transparent Power. And I was training with him and some other people. And I kind of got a more of an idea of what Dan was talking about and
yeah,
what Mike was talking about. I thought, well, maybe he's not completely full of crap.
yeah,
And then, I eventually moved back to Hawaii. And I had been kind of playing with this stuff that the person I was training with, Hasegawa Hideyuki, who went to see Kimura Tatsuo, he had been fooling with that stuff he saw, right?
yeah,
And so I went back to Hawaii, and of course, nobody was interested in it, right? And I couldn't do anything. I really had no experience, but I said,
yeah.
There's this stuff, and it seems pretty cool, but I can't do it, and
Can't do
I
it yet.
really
Yeah,
don't
yeah,
know
yeah,
that much about it. Uh, so it kind of went on the back burner until another guy, Mert Gambito, who was a Hakuryu practitioner, actually moved out to Hawaii, and he'd been on the forums too. And he called me up and he said, "Well, why don't we get some of these guys out here, right? At the least, we'll lose the cost of the ticket, right?"
yeah.
So we ended up getting Mike out, and we got Dan out, and a lot of people were very enthusiastic about Dan, so he ended up coming out quite often for a number of years, right, yearly. And I've been training with him since then, so I think it's about 15 years now, right? Although with COVID and so forth,
Fascinating. Yeah.
there was a little bit of a gap. He went through some health issues, right? So,
It's
but
super interesting.
mhm,
Like I have a very like widespread martial arts background, and I had
mhm,
some unique experiences. Like
mhm,
well, I started off in very hard styles. I started doing I did Taekwondo when I was quite young. I
mhm,
did Japanese Jiu-Jitsu when I was young, but then
yeah,
around when I was 13 or 14, I started training MMA and
mhm,
competing in grappling, competing in kickboxing and really tough stuff. And then
mhm,
around the time that I was uh, 16 or 17, I got heavily involved with yoga and ended up around that time, I started training Tai Chi and Baguazhang. And for basically the next 6 or 7 years, did that exclusively and really went fairly deep into internal stuff. And
mhm.
then uh, there came a certain point where I actually it was honestly only because I got a job teaching martial arts in another MMA school that
Yeah,
I went
yeah.
back to Brazilian Jiu Jitsu. And it was, I had this experience of like being a white belt. And, I actually submitted my first professor uh, in training using this like internal stuff.
Mhm,
Like I was doing these small circular movements, stealing his center of balance and things like that. And a bit before that, I had a coworker who was he's very good Tamiki Aikido practitioner, so I had started
mhm,
training Tamiki Aikido as well. So I kind of came back into jujitsu and Aikido from this standpoint of looking at it through the lens of the Tai Chi and the Baguazhang,
mhm.
and
Yeah,
it
yeah.
really changed the way I practice. And I was kind of like I was kind of like confused as to why in the Aikido pedagogy, like there just wasn't this explicit instruction in these internal skills. And I had the opportunity to do a seminar with Popkin and Brogna, who are Daito Ryu
Oh, yeah, yeah,
practitioners.
sure. I know Howie. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and they actually it was only there that I really saw not as explicit as it was in the Chinese arts, but
Mhm,
it was being talked about
Hmm.
explicitly at the very
Right.
least.
Right. Hmm.
And I don't think the pedagogy was as sophisticated as what I experienced in
Hmm.
Tai Chi and the Baguazhang, but it was there. And I was like, oh, this makes so much sense. And then I started to sort of dabble in various Aikido styles. So I studied a little bit of Aikikai. I studied a little bit of Iwamaru, like kind of
Hmm.
whatever, like as I would meet people, whatever I could kind of get my hands on.
Hmm.
And it was just interesting to me that by the time Daito Ryu transformed into Aikido, that it seems that this aspect of the instruction was sort of left out. um,
Mm.
I don't know
Yeah.
if that reflects your experience or what your take on that is. Like, how can we kind of like in the sense of practice? And I don't know what you do with your students or your own personal
Hmm.
practice, but how do we reintroduce this element of internal power that's very real
Hmm.
and to me seems to be kind of the heart of it, but
Yeah.
seems to
Yeah.
not really be captured so well in just training kata.
Well, that's a very tricky question, right? I think Kenji Tomiki, since you're training Tomiki, I think he wrestled with that too.
Yes.
And Jigoro Kano also
Yes.
wrestled with that. You know, in one of the early versions of Jigoro Kano's textbooks, it contains a chapter that has the entire internal power training curriculum of Shindo Yoshinryu.
Mm,
This is a story I got from Toby Threadgill, but
yeah.
apparently it was taken out later, right? And Kenji Tomiki apparently could do all these tricks. Right? I say tricks, right? But
Yeah,
but
like the
the
gin
Daitudu,
tricks.
yeah, the Jin tricks, right? So he could do the things where, if you've seen in Daitudu, where six people lift you up and then they collapse
Yes.
under you. Apparently he could do that. You know, all the stories are there, but he wasn't really interested in it.
Yeah.
And I think it's for the same reasons that Kano wasn't, right? Is that they were both interested in bringing either judo in Kano's case or in Kenji Tomiki's case, Aikido into the school curriculum, spreading it out into the school curriculum. And this stuff is difficult,
Yes.
right? It's hard to do, hard to transmit. And if you're teaching younger people, maybe they're not that interested in it.
Yeah. And
they
I
want
think
to,
there's
kick
also
some butt.
possibly erroneously, but I do think there's some realistic thread there that it seems to be
Mhm.
associated with mysticism.
Yes.
Because and the best explanation I've heard for this kind of comes from Mike, which is that the the Jin forces, the internal
Mhm.
forces, are managed unconsciously. It's done by the
Right,
subconscious,
right,
which in traditional cultures is associated with possession. It's associated with like
right, right,
you're
right.
allowing and this is what I suppose Morihei Ushiba is talking about when he talks
Mhm.
about the kami flowing through him, right? Like these
Yeah,
sort of like spirits, and that's actually what he's saying. Is he's letting the unconscious do it. He's not doing it
right,
consciously.
right. Yeah. So, I mean, you're accessing things that are, I think, that are counterintuitive, right? I mean, it's not the way you normally use your body, and
Yeah.
you're accessing things that maybe parts of your body that you don't normally access, right?
Yes.
So if you're trying to wiggle your ears, I can't wiggle my ears, but if I could, it would be entirely physical, right?
Yeah.
But then how do I connect to the nerves and the muscles that would make my ears move? I don't know, right? But traditionally you do that through this imagery, right? Visualization, imagery, the spirits. Now,
Yes.
Muriho Ueshiba was a little loopy in this way, right? He
Yeah.
actually believed in spirit possession, right? That the
Yes.
spirits were coming into him, right? And doing some of these things. And that's one of the reasons why it didn't get transmitted, right? Because people,
Yeah.
the young kids were sitting around saying, "What's he talking about?" Right? Yeah, I don't want to be possessed by any spirits, right? So his language is hard to understand, and as you say, for example, in Chinese martial arts, they have a much older and more rigorous methodology in many cases. Although it's still, because it's pre-science, maybe, or
Yeah.
pre-Western world, it's still more spiritual, right? More
Yeah.
esoteric, right,
It's
than it would be
only
today.
it was only very recently. There was a new textbook on strength training and conditioning based off of the perspective of dynamical systems theory that I was
Mhm.
reading, and
Mhm.
it's by a fellow named Franz Bosch. It's very expensive book, but really good. Um,
Mhm.
and he was talking about how there's alternate ways of utilizing the structures in the body, and he was talking about the non-contractile tissues, and that basically if you create tension on the whole system, that you can start to use the elasticity of these non-contractile tissues, and that this is, and as soon as I read it, I was like, oh wow, this is the first time I've ever
Yeah,
seen somebody from a scientific perspective even start to like creep closer to what we're talking about in terms of the internal arts. There's been so many
right,
attempts
right,
at it, but it's very challenging to describe in Western terminology
right, right.
what's happening, and probably even harder to teach that way, right? Like you can
Yeah.
teach it in the context of these traditional models, especially the Chinese one, but it is very, I don't know that I could teach it to somebody without explaining to them like, hey, there's this ancient worldview, it's not all
Yeah,
true, but we're
yeah,
just using this as
yeah.
a model so that we can subjectively access a different kind of movement, a different kind of
Right,
power.
right. Yeah, yeah. And yeah, it's tricky because there's a limited amount of usefulness that comes from actual knowledge of what's happening, right?
Yes,
Because I'm not really my knowledge of the human body is somewhat limited, right? I'm not
yeah,
a doctor, a physician, or a professional athlete. But even so, knowing how it works doesn't mean you're able to do it, right? And
yes,
the more you get into the
100%.
weeds of this very complex process, the more it just, I mean, it's interesting. And in a way, a lot of the people that we talk about it too, are really martial arts geeks. They're
Yes.
saying, well, the thing does the other thing and it hooks up to the fascia here and the tendon comes in here and this contracts and that doesn't contract. And it's all, for me, it's fascinating. But for normal people, they just want to know how to do things, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I
So,
think that's there's a lot of really good insights there that I agree
mhm,
with. I mean, number one is like
yeah,
knowledge about something, especially in martial arts, does not equal the skill of doing it,
yeah,
right? Like
yeah.
just because you know about it doesn't mean you can do it. All of
Right,
my
right,
students know how to do a single leg takedown. They can't single
right.
leg me. You know,
Yeah,
there's a difference in the skill, right? And then
yeah,
also an analogy I give a lot of times is like if you wanted to drive to California, I
yeah,
live in New York, right? So I said, if you want to
uh-huh.
drive to California, would you open up the hood of your car and start examining and messing with the engine, or would you get in your car and start driving, right?
Yeah,
So there's
yeah,
a big difference between trying to figure out how these things work and also just kind of getting on the road and getting it done.
yeah. Well, and that goes back to an important problem in martial arts in general, in that the top athletes are expected to be the best coaches,
Yes.
right? And as we look at professional sports, we know for sure often the top athletes make crappy coaches, and often the best coaches are mediocre athletes or even
Yep.
poor athletes, right?
Yeah.
And so it's a separate set of skills that sometimes
Yes.
cross over, right?
100%.
Right. And that doesn't happen very much in martial arts. Usually the person, who's teaching is whatever, ninth dan or whatever, and maybe they're fantastic, but maybe they don't know how to teach, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So Morihiro Ishiba was probably a crappy instructor from what I can tell, right? I mean, he was
Yes.
inspiring, people followed him, and that's good, right? That's from a coaching perspective. But in terms of explaining it and getting people to do, well, people kind of worked with him and maybe they got something, maybe they didn't, right?
So
Kenji
that's kind of
Tomiki
the
tried to rationalize it
I
quite a
feel
bit.
I
Yeah.
almost have the exact same take as you on
Yeah.
that, and my kind of guiding principle has been when with Aikido, which
Mhm.
I've found Aikido to be very effective. I use Aikido techniques and principles in Brazilian Jiu Jitsu against high level competitors
Yeah.
all the time. Um, very successful with Kotagaishi. You know, I can't tell you how many black belts, people who are jujitsu black belts and judo black belts, I've taken down with Kotagaish. Like I find this stuff to be very effective.
Mhm.
And what I've kind of come to with Osensei is like, do what he did, not what he says or what somebody said he says, which is also
Yeah.
a big problem that I've run into is that there seems to be like a big sort of washing of what he was said, especially perpetrated by his sons. Um, but most importantly, I've looked at his his training and his life experience and said, well,
Mm.
how can we recreate these elements? Which is one of the reasons that I do think Rondori, like training with resistance, is valuable
Mm.
because he got into fights. Like
Yeah,
he
yeah,
he had fights, so it's hard to say, okay, here's this really talented martial artist, right, with
right,
lots of
right.
training. He did all these things, but he had fights with people. So
Yeah,
if he's
yeah,
telling you don't go and fight and don't fight
yeah.
anyone ever, it's actually I'm not sure you're going to develop that way. I think some of that stuff was a part of
Yeah,
his development that he may be
yeah,
in retrospect kind of cutting out and saying no, that actually wasn't important when it actually was important.
yeah. Well, I mean, it used to be a common thing after class before the war for
Yeah.
Muruhiro Shiba and the students to play sumo, right?
Yes.
So they were interacting, right? And of course, a lot of the students had some kind of experience, and a lot of the students in the quote good old days used to go out and pick fights, right? Which is
Yeah.
not something I'd recommend for other people,
Well,
especially
I think that's
today.
the place of
But yeah,
sparring, right? Like
yeah, that's the
it's
place
a
of
much
sparring.
safer
Yeah.
way to do something similar.
Well, that's the whole spectrum, right? It's so you're applying Aikido and you found it successful, but you're also used to engaging,
Yes.
right? You're comfortable with engaging. I
Yep.
think it's very difficult for someone to go, say they come in 18 years old and they've never done anything, they've never had a fight, which is great. I mean, that says it's great. It says great things about the world today. But they just walk into a dojo and it's very difficult to go from kata training to actual engagement, right? It's a
Yes.
big jump. Some people are going
Yeah.
to be able to do it, but it's a huge jump.
Yes.
And some kind of sparring will probably help to bridge that gap, is at
Yeah.
least in theory, right? So that's something that's really come about more in modern times, right? It used to be uh, there wasn't as much sports competition, right?
Yeah.
Traditionally, I mean there was fighting, there was sparring, randori, but there wasn't much sports competition. It was
Yes.
kind of a new idea, and that's one
Yes.
of the things that is sort of problematic about Morihiro Ueshiba's ideas on competition, right? A lot of people say, well, he created an art with no competition, and it's not quite true because he learned an art with no competition,
Yes.
Daitoryu, which still today has no competition.
Yes.
And in his day, competition was a new idea, right? Jigoro Kano had reservations about sports competition. He was kind of
Yeah.
against it, right?
Yeah.
Gichin Funakoshi, who was another contemporary, never wanted sports competition. He completely prohibited it in his training, although karate is an Olympic sport today, right?
Yes.
Kendo was new relatively, right? Sakakibara Kenkichi, right? Really was one of uh, the people who instituted modern Kendo, right? And he was apparently one of the teachers of Sokaku Takeda. So it's not that long ago, right?
Yeah.
The whole competitive Kendo as a sport was a new idea. And
Yeah.
he himself had regrets later on in life about
Well,
competition. Yeah,
there are some really big challenges with that
yeah,
come with competition. When you look at Randori, like as opposed to like Shiai, right? Like drawing a distinction between sparring for the purpose of martial
right,
development
right.
and competition as a sport. There's there's already problems in Randori, and that's
Yeah,
one thing. But specifically talking about competition, there's some big problems there. Starting with as you add in rules, there are always going
mhm.
to be people who learn to play the rules in a way that's not representative of what I call like the spirit of the art. Like they're not playing the art the way that the art is meant to be done. And there's also going to
But
be people who play the rules in
yeah,
a way that's unrealistic for fighting.
yeah. Yeah. But I mean, if you think about it, why wouldn't you? I mean,
Of
of course
course.
you play, of course you're going to play the rules. You want to win, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
And I think that people game the rule set even in kata training,
Yes.
right? Right?
Yeah.
Because they want to be successful in kata training, normal modern aikikai training. And you
Yeah.
see people do their little workarounds so that they're successful and they look good. But
Yes.
the rule set is not as clearly defined, right,
Yep.
as it is in a sporting competition, right? So and if you look at much of the Aikido world today, right, the argument against competition is ethical or
Yeah.
moral, right? It's people, and Mitsuteru Ueshiba said this, Moriteru Ueshiba said this, the chairman of the International Aikido Federation said, they said they have, if people, forms of Aikido that do competition have abandoned the principles of the founder,
Yeah.
right? And it's no longer Aikido, right?
Yes.
So it's become an ethical issue, right? It's kind of evil to be, submitting people,
This has
right?
always confused me because
Yeah,
even reading some of these works that are, I can't remember the name of the Art of Peace, right? So
yeah,
even reading something like that, right? It talks about him, the founder,
mhm,
interacting with sumo wrestlers and
yeah,
interacting with baseball
yeah,
players and talking to them about the principles of Aikido and how they could use the principles of Aikido to be better at what they're doing because these principles are all encompassing and universal, that
right, right,
they reach into
yeah,
everything. So it's like I don't hear him bashing them and saying you should
yeah,
stop playing baseball. That's a competitive thing and it's unethical. Or you should stop doing
yeah,
sumo. That's a competitive, unethical, bad, naughty thing you're doing.
yeah,
I hear him saying this is my idea of Aikido is all encompassing, and you could use
yeah,
it to be better at
yeah.
anything you're doing. Uh, so I get kind of confused when people take that stance because I'm like, well, is it an all encompassing way to harmonize with what's around you, or do certain things just not fit and we have to throw them away?
Well, you're in harmony with everybody except those guys over there, right?
Yeah,
Yeah, but I mean, the fact of the matter is that he spoke about competition only rarely,
yeah.
only now and then. I mean, there are a lot of other things that nobody pays attention to anymore that he spoke about much more often.
It
And of course, if you're abandoning the principles of the founder, well, then we have to look at those things as well,
I'd
right?
be curious if you could share what some of those are because I would love to hear about that.
Well, I mean, there are things about like the training regimen, right? Like
Yeah.
shamanistic spirit position was a huge part of his training, right? But of course, nobody
Yes.
does that today, right?
Yeah.
So are we abandoning the principles of the founder? I don't know, right?
Yeah. I mean,
Uh,
you see a little bit of practice of like misogi,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
But that's probably the last thing in that like kind of realm that I see people really doing.
There's really not much there. I mean, quite a lot. I mean, if you speak to the Wama people, of course, they'll say, of course, all the other people have abandoned the Aikido of the founder, right, and so forth. Koichi Tohei, when he split from the Aikikai, said, well, those guys in the Aikikai, they're not doing Aikido anymore because it's
Yeah.
Aikido without ki. So it's a common assertion, right?
This is also a thing that I find interesting is like so during different periods of the founder's life, he did quite it seems he taught quite different things, so it's like to me I'm almost wondering like maybe all of these people are right, he just showed them all slightly different things. Like there were just different periods of his development and the way he was teaching, and they ended up with different pieces of the puzzle, so to speak, and then they all, instead of putting them together, they seem to kind of tend to argue over which one is right.
I tend to think he was pretty consistent in
Interesting.
what he was doing. If you look from the pre-war to the post-war periods, and there's a video which compares the pre-war and the post-war
Ah,
periods. I don't know if you've seen it.
no, I haven't,
It's
but I'd love to check that
mainly
out.
based around the 1935 film and then films from the 50s and 60s and also still shots. And seeing them side by side is really striking because
Huh.
it's the same. I
Wow.
mean, it's literally the same. I mean, and you see he's older, right,
So
in the
why do you think
60s.
people ended up with such disparate views on what he was doing?
Well, a lot of that was marketing, right? And the people who came afterwards,
Yeah.
right? So, I mean, Kishimaru Ueshiba, marketed Aikido in a certain way, for better or worse. I don't think he meant anything evil, right? About changing, people accuse him of changing the art, so forth. Of course, he was in a difficult position, and he created an art that spread everywhere, right? Aikikai is the largest Aikido
Yeah.
organization in the world. It's spread out. Kenji Tomiki changed, what he was doing for his purposes. Of course, he introduced introduction, and he rationalized many of the techniques and the training systems. Yoshinkan, even though the Yoshinkan is often represented as pre-war Aikido, I mean, most of the things that make Yoshinkan unique came after the war, right? As um, they created their structured curriculum. Koichi Tohei, of course, had his own ideas
Yeah.
and went off. So they each went off into their own directions. And of course, that happens naturally, right?
Yeah.
But it's probably um, more obvious in this case because there was so much lack of direction from Morihiro Ueshiba himself,
Huh.
right? I mean, when he
Yeah.
was talking, nobody knew what he was talking about, right?
Yes.
And he was pretty much retired after the war. He wasn't in Hombu very much. He wasn't even in Iwama very much, right? He was traveling around doing his own thing. So people went off on their own. And a lot of the things that came about were responsive, right? Kishimoto Ueshiba instituted the Dan ranking system in the Aikikai largely because they had it in the Yoshinkan, right?
Yes.
So in the 50s, the Yoshinkan was rising, and there was some concern, a lot of panic maybe, that the Yoshinkan would become the dominant form of Aikido, right? So, Gozo Shudo was quite skilled, right? He was, charismatic, skilled. He was becoming popular. He became famous in a popular, a very famous Aikido demonstration in 1954,
Mm.
right? And then he was connected, right? I don't know whether that was his personal connections. I know his father was very well connected with the right-wing military elite before the war. I don't know if that carried over, but he got some powerful supporters. He opened a brand new dojo, and Hombu dojo at the time, the roof had fallen in, and there were refugees living on the mat. So Kishimoto is saying, well, how are we going to survive? So they started things like down ranking system, right?
Interesting.
They started the first public demonstrations. The first all Japan demonstrations were a result of that, right? Because Shioda's giving demonstrations, we have to as
We
well,
have to too. Yes.
right?
Yes.
And then maybe the largest thing was the cult of Ueshiba, right? The cult of Morihiro Ueshiba, right?
Yeah.
Because Gosu Shioda was becoming popular, right? So what do we have? Well, we have the founder, right? And so that's when it became the founder, the founder, the founder, right? The
Interesting.
founder. Okay, this is the founder's Aikido. This is the founder's dojo. Shioda doesn't have that.
Yes.
He's just some kid, right? Uh, and then the same thing happened again when Kenji Tomiki started to institute competition, right? At that time, Kishimoto Ueshiba and the Aikikai had kind of staked out the position of a non-competitive martial art. And at that time, after the war, it was kind of unusual, right? The normal person was familiar with things like judo and
Yes.
kendo, maybe, right? They're both competitive arts. And you see some of the early students after the war, they say, why did you start? They said, well, I heard about this art, Aikido, and it was so unusual, an art with no competition, right? Of
Huh.
course, they didn't look back historically and see that this was, the normal set of things for traditional martial arts. There was no sporting competition, right? These are all young people, so they join in, and then Kenji Tomiki comes along, and they had to double down, right? Because there was again panic that well, he's going to introduce competition. Maybe it's going to blow up and become popular the way judo did, right? And then so what do we do? Well, we have to double down on that. So people who compete are not doing Aikido now, of course, and we have to reinforce that because that's our marketing message, right? It's very hard to pivot with these things, right?
Yeah.
Um, if you're old enough to remember old Coke, the original Coke, they switched to new Coke. Right, there's a book written by one of the executives at Pepsi, the person who instituted the Michael Jackson commercials, right? Which and his argument was the title of the book was the other guy blinked,
Yes.
right? And his argument was that those commercials are really what made Coke change old Coke to new Coke, because
Huh.
old Coke had always depended on the marketing message of tradition, American summers, right? The old country farm, and
Yeah.
Pepsi was the taste of a new generation,
Huh.
right? So then they pivoted, and of course it was kind of a marketing disaster, right? New Coke. So rather than doing that, Kishimoto doubled down, right? And instead of being able to make some kind of agreement with Kenji Tomiki, right? They split. I mean, I'm sure there were a lot of discussions right? Yeah, I'm sure they both have their own opinions, but they split, and that was that.
It's fascinating. Yeah,
But
I
it's always the issue with competition that, I mean, you see what happened in judo. A lot of the older judo students, Kimura Matsuhiko for one, really dislike modern judo,
yes,
right? They say it became too sportsmanlike. So
yep,
there's always that problem with too much competition,
yeah,
right?
no,
Or too little.
absolutely. I think it's
I
very
think,
hard, like because you go from there's I do think there's a distinction between martial art and combat sport, right? And
yeah,
in order to it's a very delicate balance in martial arts that
yeah,
also have a sporting element that's emphasized to maintain that. You know, you need
mhm,
other practices and other aspects to sort of anchor the certain aspects of the art in the martial in the realm of martial art, and you need other
yeah,
sort of there's other planes of development than the purely just the sporting one. And it's a weird
yeah,
catch 22 because I also think that the sporting element, maybe just in the form of randori, but also sometimes in the form of competition, can be a wonderful vehicle for this development if it's
mhm,
approached in the right way. Like I've seen one strange thing that I've experienced that has been honestly a bit disheartening and disappointing for me personally was when I started bringing Aikido techniques into jujitsu and promoting
mhm,
what I was doing, because a lot of older martial artists who I knew personally were very excited about it. They're like, this is interesting. It's different. It's cool. It's something that people
mhm,
don't know about. You should publicize this a bit. And I thought that when I did this, that the people who would be the most against it would be people in the combat sports arena. But it turned out that the most vicious and aggressive attacks that came my way were from Aikidoka. That
yeah,
they were the
yeah,
most upset by it, and it sort of changed my perspective a little bit on maybe some of the combat sports actually is good for people in terms of their personal development. Like we
mhm.
don't normally think about like the spiritual benefits of randori or competition, but I was like these this other group of people seem to be a little bit more open minded, and I do think there's something like kind of touching on something you said much earlier was that when you do when you're training in the environment of say like aikikai, right, or a very kata based art, it still
Mhm,
is there is this whole game that goes on. I've even
mhm.
experienced it in spiritual circles, like
Yeah,
when I was doing yoga and meeting different gurus and people who perform rituals. There's all this jockeying for pole position, but
mhm.
because the system isn't so delineated, it tends
Right,
to devolve and become a little bit more underhanded than what goes on in, say, a jujitsu class where everybody knows
right, right.
you can beat the other person
Yeah,
and everybody knows that that's what's important. Like
yeah,
the pecking order becomes very clear and it's
yeah,
clearly based on something specific as opposed to in these other environments it starts to get a little muddy.
mhm,
One thing I've experienced a lot of too in training both aikido and also in chinese arts is people who will like kind of nitpick your technique in a way that I don't feel is particularly productive just to prove that they know something, right? So
right, right.
I
Yeah,
think this is kind of like one of the reasons why all of these arts are declining in popularity with younger generations is that they just don't want to be treated like that. They don't want to be,
yeah,
excessively patronized in a way that they can feel inherently isn't productive. It's one thing when someone's really trying to help you because my Tai Chi
mhm,
teacher was like that. He really wanted to help you. He wasn't trying
yeah,
to just
yeah,
tell you something to bother you or to show that he knew more. It was like,
yeah,
no, I really want to help you. But then you have these kind of first generation students of his who were tended to be a little bit like that. And they would come in
yeah.
and be like, oh, this thing you're doing is totally wrong. I'm like, well, Richard said it was fine. Like my teacher said it was fine. So I don't really care what you think. But it's
Yeah,
very interesting that you say that it makes sense that some of this change in the practices seems to have mostly happened in that first generation of students. That's
yes,
really where
yes,
the changes in the practice came in.
yeah. I mean, and there's nothing wrong with that. I mean,
No.
people practice it and they enjoy it. I think there's a difficulty with a lot of the assertions people make, and the appeals that they make because it's not sports based, right? So there's no clear standard for proving what you do, right? If you're a
Yeah.
boxer, there is really no question of what you do, right? You either win or you
Yes.
don't, right? In Aikido, well, there's a lot of lineage, right? Well, I'm right because I trained with whoever, Billy Bob Sensei,
Yeah.
or I'm right because Morihiro Ishiba said I was right, maybe. So there are a lot of appeals and there are a lot of questionable assertions, right? So there you get a lot of people in modern Aikido who say, well, I don't want to fight and I'm not interested in fighting, which is great. But then
Yeah.
they
There's
said, but
nothing
I
wrong
could
with
fight
that.
if I really wanted to, right? If I really wanted to fight, I'd be okay.
Yeah.
It's like, well, I don't know. I mean, you really can't be good at something you don't do, right?
Yes.
So I mean, and there's nothing wrong with that. So and part of that is because there's no real testing, right? There's no
Yeah.
pressure testing to keep things at least kind of honest. Right. And traditionally, I mean, if you're studying a traditional yuha, right, the teacher is supposed to keep you honest, right?
Yes.
In classical martial traditions in Japan,
Yes.
the uke is the teaching position, right?
Yes.
Right. So they're not trying to make you look good. They're trying to set the situation for you to learn, and they're supposed
Yeah.
to be keeping you honest. But it's very difficult because you have to be
No.
very honest yourself, right?
It's very, very hard. And I
It's
think that
very,
it's
very hard.
actually
Yeah.
more challenging than just sparring.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
you can tell somebody, hey, just don't let me do this thing any way you can, and
Yeah.
they'll be able to do it honestly. But when you to be a good uke, and this is something I actually really struggled with personally in
Mhm.
jujitsu. My coach used to complain about me constantly that I was a terrible uke, that I was the worst uke.
Yeah.
And it was only after I got my black belt in Brazilian Jiu
Yeah.
Jitsu that I finally was able to do it. And it's the best quote I can honestly think of with this
Mhm.
is it's from Enter the Dragon with Bruce Lee when he talks
Uh-huh.
about he's like a good fight is like a small play but played
Right. Right.
seriously. And
Mhm.
it's much like that in the sense that the uke has a role to play, and the uke has
Right.
to
Right.
understand the exact role that they're playing for that
Mhm.
particular technique, because a technique is a particular person's solution to a
Right.
particular
Right.
problem that they've encountered in martial arts. So you have to be, as the uke, you have to be that problem. If you don't
Right.
understand
Right.
both the solution and the problem,
Yeah.
then
Yeah.
it's almost impossible to do properly, and you're not able to feed the tori or the nage properly, and it's
Right.
not going to
Right.
happen.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's very, very hard.
It's very, very hard, and it got kind of flipped in Aikido, right?
Yes.
And in Aikido, the teacher is always the nage,
Yes.
right? And there's kind of a feeling that you don't want to challenge them, right? Because they're supposed to look good,
Yeah.
and you're assuming they know what they're doing,
I
and
mean, my
yeah.
my Aikido sensei was doing ukemi for quite a famous Tamiki practitioner, and he messed up a fall, and the guy just broke his hand. Just like,
Yeah.
don't do that again. Don't make me look bad again.
Oh, yeah, yeah. I mean, there's the famous demonstration in Manchuria, right, with Hideo Oba, where
Yeah.
Hideo Oba goes to challenge, well, kind of challenge to push Morihiro Ishiba, right? And the irony is that Oba thought that Ueshiba did really well; he was able to handle it, right?
Yeah.
But then Ueshiba got pissed off, right? Because of course he's not looking good, yeah.
Yes.
So there's that thing that feeds into it and that gradually magnifies itself from generation to generation. So it gets more and more collaborative, right?
Yes.
And of course, all training is collaborative, right? It's all
Yeah.
cooperative. It's all set within a
100%.
certain agreed upon rule set. Even MMA is an agreed upon
Yeah.
rule set, but it requires on people. Requires that people be very honest, right? And the less objective the standards are, the more honest you have to be, right?
Yes.
Because if you're competing, right, there's no question, a point is a point, right?
Yep.
But if you're not competing, then, well, how do we know if we're successful? Did you really let me throw you or not? I mean,
Yeah.
it's a big challenge. I know I train
Yes.
with one of my teachers, well, Dan. Dan Harden. And he says, "Of course I'm cooperating. If I weren't cooperating, you'd never throw me,
Yeah.
right?" And not only because he's very skilled, but he's also twice my size. When I
Yes.
do something with him, my head hits his chest, right in the middle of his sternum or something. So it's just like, why would I ever fight a guy like that anyway, right? But of course they're cooperating, but they have to do it
Yeah.
correct way, and that's not really taught in most Aikido places, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
No, I think that that would make a huge difference. I'm very
yeah,
lucky in that my Tamiki Aikido sensei is not a very prolific teacher, and for the course of maybe the 12 years I've been training with him, most of our training has been one on one. So he's
yeah,
always been my uke, and it is a lot like you say. There was a point in my training where
mhm,
just fit like because I was young when we started, and I've grown a lot. I started out being maybe 150 pounds. I'm about 220 now, and
yeah,
much more seasoned in fighting, and where I felt that just my physical power started to surpass his as he got older. But
yeah,
in the beginning, like, I couldn't move him an inch if he didn't want me
yeah,
to, and but he would take the falls for me when it was right. And
mhm,
if it wasn't
yeah,
right, he would stop and just stand there in some awkward position and be like, no, 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 this isn't, you're not doing this. So I think it's interesting that you say this, and now thinking about it, I'm like, wow,
mhm,
I think I really lucked out and benefited from that training environment in a way that
mhm,
almost
yeah,
was accidental, but
yeah,
turned out
yeah,
to be phenomenally helpful. I'm very curious. Maybe you could share just a little bit about like your personal approach to teaching and practicing Aikido, because you obviously have a wealth of knowledge about the history and the practical aspects, and I'm just curious like how it all kind of comes out. Maybe you could try to emphasize what you do that's different than
mhm.
other people, and maybe also talk a little bit about what you have kept that you feel like is valuable.
Well, of course, I relocated to Japan, so I'm not really training right now because I'm house hunting. So I'm
Yes.
not sure where I'm going to end up. Once that settles down, then when we figure out where we're living and so forth. But back in Hawaii, most of our guys, as I said, we brought over Dan Harden, right, and then we split off into our own group, our own training group, and some of the training sessions were very eclectic, right? Aikido people and non-Aikido people,
Yeah.
right? So if you're familiar with the Sangenkai method, Dan's method, it's mainly a method of body usage and conditioning, right? So if we're talking about internal power, some people hate the term, right? Internal training, internal skills, body skills, Aiki,
I mean, we
Jin,
we need a term,
whatever.
right? Like,
Yeah, you need a term,
we need a
right?
term.
So
We need to make a distinction between that and other things. So maybe it's
well,
not the
yeah,
best
yeah,
term
yeah.
historically or whatever. Maybe Sun Lutang was, an idiot, but it's for my purposes, it's fine.
Yeah, yeah. Well, this is how the problem started. I remember I trained with one internal teacher, Sam Chen, actually from
Yeah,
Chuan. I don't know. I
yeah,
spent a
yeah.
couple of years
I'm very
doing
familiar with
Chuan.
him because the monastery where I started training in Buddhist meditation was where he originally started his
Oh, okay,
classes.
okay.
Yeah,
Yeah,
in
yeah,
Carmel.
yeah. Sam is great. He's a great guy. He's got a very good method.
Yeah.
Um, but one of the things he said to me once that I really liked was he said, the thing about internal power is that it's power.
Yes.
Right, it's all power, right? And if you look back, that's really true. The divisions internal and external are kind of artificial. I mean, they're
Yes.
useful, but
Absolutely.
they're artificial. I mean, everyone's using the same body, right? Everybody's using
Yes.
the same mind. But from our point of view, we're talking about training methods and body usage that is generally different
Yep.
than external methods. So if we're talking about external methods, we'd be talking about speed, timing, we're talking about angles, we're talking about leverage, we're talking
Yes.
about things that are expressed in relation to another person, right?
Yes.
Basically, jujitsu, right?
Yeah.
And this is kind of the division that happens in Daitoryu classically, right? They have jujitsu, right? They have Aiki no Jitsu, Aiki jujitsu, right? So if we're talking about internal power, we're talking about generally about things that are described relative to ourselves, our own body, right?
Yes.
Body usage, body conditioning, accommodating incoming force, generating outgoing force, right? And how that's done. So it's all done within the frame of our own body rather than relative to somebody else, right?
Yes.
So when we started training in Hawaii, that's mainly what we focused on. And most of the people were quite advanced,
Yeah.
right? So one of my guys that I trained with for many years in Hawaii, one-on-one often, was actually there when at the floating restaurant when Kuchitohe broke off from the Aikikai
Oh
during,
wow.
when he came in and announced his break. And that's how far back he went, right?
Wow.
So a lot of the people were all experienced in Aikido. Everybody knows the techniques. Um,
Yes.
Probably some of them got bored with the techniques, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you're doing these techniques, you don't really know why, but I mean, that's what we do, right?
Yeah.
And you're doing them over and over again. I guess you're trying to get better, but there's no real metric for getting better, right? There's
Yes,
nothing, no way to
exactly.
measure that, you know? So a lot of the Aikido guys who were training with us were, or the Aikido folks, right, the male and female, were quite experienced, right?
Yeah.
And some of the people, as I say, were other people, right? BJJ people or Taekwondo people or other Japanese Koryu people. So the emphasis was on body training, right? The usage of the body and how to condition it, how to use it. And we start slow. We do with a lot of um, push tests, and then push tests while moving, push tests while moving under pressure. Body usage. If we had a lot of Aikido people, often we'd work on body usage and then work that into a classical, right,
Yeah.
Aikido technique. But we didn't do a lot of techniques. So if we're doing a class, we might have done maybe one technique in a couple
Yeah.
hours, right? So we start out with body usage and then maybe we focus on one thing.
Yeah.
As I
Because
said, I think this is
each little
each
micro
part,
piece of the technique becomes a lot
right?
more challenging when you're trying to integrate it with using that sort of different type of force.
Right.
It takes
It
time to
takes
work through even just a
takes time
simple
to work
move.
through. Right. Right.
Yeah.
So we were talking previously about limiting variables, right, in training.
Yes.
Right. And of course, especially in the Aikikai, the way that people get thrown into it is they come into class and they throw them into class and they do like Yokomanuchi Shihonage, which is an enormously complicated technique on maybe their
Yeah.
first or second day, and then they don't know how to walk, they don't know how to stand up, right?
Yes.
They don't know how to strike, right?
Yeah.
But they're doing this thing, right? So we kind of work backwards on that a lot. So if we're
Yes.
doing one thing, say we're doing working on the shoulder, how do you lift your arms? What happens in the shoulder,
Yeah.
right? Okay, then I've lifted up my shoulder. How do I extend my hand, right? How do I extend my hand and what is it connected to? Where's this happening from, right?
Yeah.
And then eventually, maybe towards the end of the class, we'd get to, if we were lucky, we'd get to the end of a technique, but it would take a lot of time, right?
Yeah. I mean,
And since we'd already been through the techniques, there's no problem. I
this
mean,
is
it's more,
almost exactly how
yeah,
my Tai Chi training was. Like, I
right,
mean,
right,
I spent when I first started the Bagwajang, I spent 6 months on the first move, which was just sticking my right foot out.
yeah,
I spent a whole
yeah,
6 months. I would come twice a week for 2 hours, just sticking my right foot out, just learning to sink the body down and make the foot come out because it was being pushed out by the body.
right,
And
right,
I mean, it's a punishing method to
yeah,
learn through, but it also, looking back, had so much value because
yeah,
just as you said, you learn, well, how do I step, how do I stand,
yeah,
how do I lift the arm, and then this stuff. It was interesting when I went to train with Howard and Pop and Brogna and Popkin. They were like, oh man, like you really know how to do this, the Aikiage. And I was like, well, I've been doing this for like 10 years.
right. How
Like,
do
we
you
do the
lift your
same thing
arms,
in
right?
my Tai
Yeah,
Chi class every
right,
single
yeah,
day for
yeah,
hours.
yeah. Right. And it's difficult because it is, as I said before, it's counterintuitive the way
Yes.
you're supposed to do it in many ways. I remember one story that Dan would told us when he was training with his teacher. One day they're driving home after training, and Dan's saying, "Man, he's lying to us. Shoulders don't work that way."
Yeah.
right? And so, yeah, it's very counterintuitive and
Yeah.
it's difficult. I know some people sometimes online, you see people, oh, they're internal power people, they're just trying to get a shortcut to getting good. Well, I don't know. I haven't found any shortcut yet because
It's
it's a lot
certainly not a
harder.
shortcut.
Certainly not a shortcut, but at least you can feel that you're getting somewhere, right?
If
I mean,
anything, it's
traditional
longer.
kata training, I guess, if you look at it, in theory, if you're correctly guided, it's supposed to shape your body and teach you the body usage in the correct way.
Yeah.
But I think it's a very slow method,
Yes.
right? And it's fraught with pitfalls,
Yeah.
right? If the teacher doesn't know what they're doing, or if they don't communicate it directly, you end up with people just practicing the form. And this happens in Tai Chi, Bagua, Xingyi all the time, right?
Yep.
You see people, they're going through the form. Look, I can do cloud hands. See,
Yes.
and
There's
you
no
got,
connection.
and there's no connection at all, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, it's quite problematic, right?
It's
And
very
going the
interesting
other
too.
way is hard too. So yeah, it's but at least you know what you're doing if you
Yes.
do it this way.
Yes. It's fascinating because the further I get into it with this type of training, I start to feel like once you've developed the right body, right? Once the
Mhm.
body is there, like the Aiki body or the the Tai Chi body, like or there's
Right,
one
right.
teacher says like become the Tai Chi creature, right? Like once you've become an Aikido creature, there
Mhm.
really is no wrong movement.
Yeah.
Before
Well,
before
that's
the
what
body's
Maruhiro
moving.
Shiba used to say, right? He used to say, when I move, it becomes Aiki,
Yes.
right? Right.
Yes.
And Yukiyoshi Sagawa, the Daitorio instructor, used to say something very similar, right? So I mean, it's all about body usage, and the overemphasis on kata training tends to lock people into the box,
Yes.
right? You've trained your body, and it's not necessarily a bad method of training, but you've conditioned yourself to move that specific way all the time, right? And so then what happens when you're in another situation? It's a lot of times it's very difficult to get out of the box. I mean, if you look at, say, Yoshinkan Aikido, which I love about Yoshinkan Aikido, I'm not
Yeah.
bad mouthing it, but they have an extremely tightly structured curriculum and a way of
Yes.
holding the body, moving their body, standing
Yeah.
and moving. And it's very consistent. They can develop people's and condition people's bodies very consistently. They've been successful in that, but I think for a lot of people, it's hard for them to get out of that box,
Yes.
right? Once they're in there. I trained, I used to train with a direct student, Gozo Shioda, in Yoshinkan. And one of the things he used to say to me is like, how can you change so quickly? How can you
Yeah.
adapt so quickly, right? Because from his method, it was hard for him to switch out of what he was doing into doing
Yeah.
something else, right? And again, some people can do that, but yeah, some people can't. So in what we found in the body focus method, especially the Sangenkai method, is very agnostic, right? So we have a
Yeah.
lot of people from
Yeah.
Aikido and BJJ and Taekwondo and boxing and MMA. We had people that had no martial arts experience at all. I
It's
don't know
open
why.
source Aiki.
Open source Aiki. It's very agnostic and it's very adaptable. So
Yeah.
like I see people who are good at it and they step into somebody else's rule set, whether it's Tai Chi push hands or karate or something. And there's a learning curve when you pick up the rule set, right? Because you have to figure out, well, what are we doing here?
Yes.
Right. But the learning curve gets very short,
Yeah.
right?
They're
Because
able to import those skills that they have very
you're
quickly.
you're able to import the skills very quickly, whereas the opposite is not always true. People who have
Yes.
only trained in that rule set, for them to step into another rule set, I think is often quite difficult.
Challenging. Yep.
It's often quite challenging. And if you look at people before the war in Japan, say the martial arts before the war, all the people we idolize, right? They all kind of knew each other, right? It was a
Yes.
small community. They all
Yeah.
kind of kicked around and they train with each other and mess around and fight sometimes, right? So Kaka Takeda traveled around the country for years, challenging people, and
Yep.
they were all kind of connected, right? Ueshiba
Yeah.
was connected to Kano, is connected to Funakoshi, was connected to, the founder of Hakoryu, is connected to, these famous kendo guys. And so there was a lot of interaction and training, and that I think is less true today. right?
Yes.
And people tend to be single source martial artists, right?
Yep.
They're trained one martial art for 40 years or 30 years, right? And then it's hard for them to step out of the box into something else, right?
Yeah. No, absolutely.
Yeah.
It was interesting for me transitioning between Tai Chi and Aikido because there was this one thing that would always happen
Mhm.
in a lot of Tamiki training. There's this emphasis on keeping the arm very straight, and
Right, right.
I would bend my arms because in the Tai Chi your arms are bent quite often, and everyone would always say, "Don't bend your arm. You're using muscle." And I'd be like, I swear to God, I'm not using muscle. Like I get that you want me to have my arms straight, and I'll straighten my
Right,
arm
right.
for you, but it doesn't automatically mean that I'm using muscle just because my arm is bent, you know. And it was
Yeah,
just such a funny thing because I think that box you're talking about it had led people to have this assumption within the sphere of Tamiki that
yeah,
if your arm was bent, then you had to be using muscle. And I'm like, you realize there's whole arts out there where people bend their arms and don't use just pure, external muscle.
yeah, yeah. And well, a lot of that's because reasons are often not discussed.
Yes.
All right, in martial arts, right? You do something. Why are you doing it? We don't know why because sensei said so, right? And
Yes.
part of that's a Japanese thing. That's the way Japanese culture often works.
Yes.
Why are we doing this? I don't know. No,
They told
sensei
us to
said
do
so.
it this way.
They told us to do it. This is the way kimarita.
Yeah.
It's decided. This is the way we do it, right? And often later in Japanese culture, you see people invent justifications after the fact.
Yeah.
I call it an after the fact rationalization, which is like you do it for no reason at all because the teacher do it, and then later on you have to think up a reason why you're doing it, and then you see these teachers give these explanations. Oh, well, this is why we hold our hands this way. And well, I don't know, that doesn't sound quite right, you know.
Yeah.
But in the West, of course, people are more analytical, right?
Yes.
And so there've been more changes. But part of that's cultural, right? In Japan, I think that's also Asia, and part of that was, especially in Aikido and Daitoryu too, I think, is the predilection for secrecy,
Yes.
right? In many arts, particularly in Daitoryu, right?
Yeah.
That some Daitoryu folks have a mania about secrecy. I think that comes from Sokaku Takeda. But even Chinese arts,
Yep.
there's some Chinese forms of Taiji where they don't teach the women the forms, right?
Yes.
Because women marry outside the family.
Yeah.
And then the art flows outside the family. So you only
Yes.
teach it to the men so that you keep it
Yeah. You keep
secret.
it. The
Yeah.
Very interesting. Well, thank you
And
so much for doing this. This was a really, I mean,
yeah,
just on my end, I learned a whole lot of really interesting stuff, and I really appreciate you coming on and doing this. It was
no, no,
fantastic.
thank you very much. Yeah.
I think we didn't get through nearly half of the questions I had for you. So at
No,
some
I
point,
think we
maybe
left
we'll
a
have
lot on
to
the
come back
table.
and do another one.
Sure, sure.
But I really appreciate it. Thanks so much.
No, thank you very much.